a tactical debriefing report from the 36th Infantry Division, filed on March 23, 1945, and classified confidential for reasons the documenting officer never clearly explained, contains an account of an operation that should have been impossible, according to conventional military doctrine. The report describes the elimination of 14 reinforced German bunkers in a single 8-hour period by a force consisting of 1 NCO and 3 enlisted men, a casualty-to-force ratio and operational tempo that the division intelligence officer annotated with a handwritten note. Recommend verification of reported results. Numbers inconsistent with known capabilities of 4-man element against fortified positions. The verification came from multiple sources over the following days. German prisoners captured when their positions collapsed reported that their defensive line had been systematically destroyed during a single night by forces they never saw or heard until their bunkers were already compromised. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed that 14 bunkers, documented as operational on March 22, were destroyed or abandoned by March 23, and American infantry units advancing through the sector reported encountering no resistance from positions that intelligence had assessed would require days of fighting to overcome. The 4-man team had been led by Staff Sergeant Thomas Tso, a Chiricahua Apache from Arizona, who'd been assigned to the division as a demolition specialist, but who'd approached his platoon commander 3 days before the operation with a proposal that the officer initially dismissed as tactically absurd. "Sir, I can eliminate those bunkers without artillery preparation, without direct assault, without the casualties conventional approach would cost, but I need tactical autonomy to do it using methods that aren't in the field manual." The platoon commander, Lieutenant Harold Morrison, later described his response in a personal letter that wouldn't be discovered until decades after his death. "I told Sergeant Tso that bunker elimination required combined arms coordination, that demolitions teams needed support from suppressive fire and assault elements, that 4 men couldn't possibly eliminate 14 fortified positions regardless of how skilled they were." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read and said, "Sir, Apache warriors took fortified positions from the U.S. Army for decades using methods the Army couldn't counter. The Germans aren't better defended than cavalry forts were, and they don't understand terrain the way Apache do. If you give me 3 men and 1 night, I'll show you what silent warfare looks like." Morrison authorized the operation, he wrote, not because he believed it would succeed, but because conventional approaches had been producing casualty rates that were unsustainable, and because Sergeant Tso's confidence suggested either useful local knowledge or, at minimum, a creative approach that might reveal tactical opportunities conventional planning had missed. I expected him to gather intelligence and maybe eliminate 1 or 2 bunkers if he was extraordinarily lucky, Morrison wrote. What happened instead changed how I understood what training and cultural knowledge could achieve. The operation Tso conducted that night combined traditional Apache tactical methods with modern demolitions in ways that created capabilities no military doctrine accounted for. He used silence not as absence of sound, but as tactical dominance of the audio environment, controlling what the enemy heard so completely that his team's presence became undetectable, despite proximity that should have made detection inevitable. He moved through terrain using knowledge that came from cultural inheritance about how to read landscape and become invisible in it, adapting methods developed for hunting and warfare in southwestern mountains to European defensive positions. and he destroyed 14 bunkers in 8 hours, using tactics that were so far outside conventional military thinking that German survivors described the attack in terms that suggested supernatural capabilities rather than tactical skill. Bunkers that had seemed secure, suddenly compromised by attackers who appeared from nowhere, eliminated defenders or forced surrender, destroyed positions, and vanished before adjacent bunkers could respond or even understand what had happened. The division intelligence officers' skepticism about the reported results reflected institutional bias that couldn't reconcile 4 men achieving what should have required a reinforced company. But the results were undeniable, documented not just in American reports, but in the collapse of German defensive positions and the testimony of prisoners who described being defeated by forces they'd never detected until their positions were already lost. This is the story of how one Apache sergeant's tactical knowledge, rooted in cultural traditions about silent movement, environmental reading, and warfare methods that existed outside Western military doctrine, proved more effective than conventional combined arms operations, achieved in one night what should have taken days or weeks, and demonstrated capabilities that military training couldn't replicate because they came from knowledge systems that formal instruction had no framework for transmitting. To understand how Sergeant Tso achieved the impossible and why his methods remained largely unacknowledged despite extraordinary results, we need to go back to the tactical problem his division faced in March 1945, and the moment when desperation made conventional commanders willing to consider approaches that violated everything they'd been trained to believe about how warfare should be conducted. By March 1945, American forces advancing through southern Germany were encountering defensive positions that represented the culmination of years of German fortification experience. The bunkers weren't crude fieldworks, but sophisticated reinforced structures, concrete walls thick enough to withstand direct artillery hits, interlocking fields of fire that made approach from any direction suicidal, camouflage and positioning that made them difficult to locate until attackers were already exposed to defensive fires. The tactical problem these bunkers created was brutally simple. They couldn't be effectively destroyed without accepting casualties that were strategically unsustainable. Artillery bombardment could suppress but rarely destroyed well-constructed bunkers, and the resources required, ammunition, time, coordination, made each bunker elimination a significant undertaking. Airstrikes were similarly limited. The bunkers were too small and too well camouflaged to be reliably targeted from the air, and close air support risked hitting American forces in proximity to German positions. Direct assault, infantry attacking with supporting arms to suppress defensive fires while demolitions teams approached close enough to destroy bunkers, was the doctrinal solution, but it was horrifically expensive in lives. Each bunker elimination required multiple infantry squads, careful coordination, suppressive fire that consumed ammunition at unsustainable rates, and almost inevitably resulted in casualties among the assault and demolitions personnel. The 36th Infantry Division faced a sector where intelligence had identified at least 50 German bunkers, creating a defensive line that couldn't be bypassed and that would have to be eliminated to continue the advance. At the casualty rates conventional bunker assault was producing, clearing the sector would cost hundreds of American lives and consume weeks that operational planning couldn't afford. A divisional planning meeting in mid-March 1945 laid out the problem with uncomfortable clarity. The operations officer presented the tactical options. We can conduct a sustained artillery bombardment followed by infantry assault on each bunker sequentially. Estimated timeline is 3 to 4 weeks, with projected casualties approaching 400–500. Alternatively, we can request additional artillery and air support to destroy bunkers before assault, which extends timeline to 5 weeks and still projects significant infantry casualties during final clearance operations. The division commander's response captured the desperation. Those timelines are unacceptable, and those casualty projections are devastating. We're supposed to be advancing rapidly to maintain pressure on a collapsing enemy, not spending a month eliminating bunkers at a cost that will gut our combat effectiveness. There has to be a better approach. That's when Lieutenant Morrison mentioned Sergeant Tso's proposal. Morrison had been skeptical when Tso first approached him, but faced with the division's tactical bind, he presented it as an unconventional option worth considering. I have an Apache NCO who claims he can eliminate bunkers using infiltration and silent approach methods that come from traditional indigenous warfare. He's confident he can destroy multiple bunkers in a single night using a 4-man team and standard demolitions, operating without artillery support or conventional assault forces. The response from senior officers ranged from skepticism to outright dismissal. The division operations officer stated bluntly, "We're not going to base operational planning on claims from one sergeant that he can use Indian tactics to do what requires combined arms coordination. This is modern warfare against prepared German defenses, not raiding cavalry outposts with bows and arrows." But the division commander was desperate enough to consider any option that might reduce casualties and accelerate the timeline. What exactly is he proposing? What are these traditional methods that supposedly work against reinforced concrete bunkers? Morrison explained what Tso had described, using silent movement techniques to approach bunkers undetected, exploiting German assumptions about what approaches were possible and where threats would come from, operating at night when visibility and defensive awareness were degraded, and using cultural knowledge about patience and environmental reading to identify moments when bunkers were vulnerable despite appearing secure. The explanation sounded implausible to officers trained in conventional doctrine, but the division commander authorized a limited trial. Tso could attempt to eliminate bunkers in a specific sector, with conventional forces positioned to exploit any success but prepared to execute standard assault if the unconventional approach failed. "I'm authorizing this," the commander stated, "not because I believe it will work, as described, but because conventional methods are unacceptable, and we need to try approaches that might reduce casualties even if they seem tactically questionable. If this sergeant can eliminate even 3 or 4 bunkers using his methods, that's progress. If he fails, we proceed with conventional assault." The authorization set the stage for Sergeant Tso to prove that Apache tactical knowledge could achieve what combined arms doctrine couldn't. That silent warfare was more effective than firepower and mass, and that one night of operations using traditional indigenous methods could accomplish what weeks of conventional combat would struggle to achieve. Staff Sergeant Thomas Tso grew up on the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona, learning traditional knowledge from his grandfather, who'd been born during the period when Apache warriors were still actively resisting U.S. military efforts to control their territories. That knowledge included specific tactical methods for approaching and eliminating fortified positions, techniques developed when Apache bands faced U.S. Army cavalry forts that were, in their own context, as formidable as German bunkers were in 1945. The fundamental insight Tso brought from Apache tradition was that fortifications created a false sense of security that could be exploited. Defenders in bunkers believed they were safe because the structures protected them from direct fire and because they could observe approaches and engage any visible threat. But that security was psychological more than absolute. Bunkers had vulnerabilities that patient, silent attackers who understood how to read terrain and exploit defensive assumptions could use. Apache tradition taught specific methods for this kind of warfare. Silent approach wasn't just about moving quietly. It was about understanding the sensory environment so completely that you could predict what defenders would hear, see, and perceive, and position your movements to remain below their detection threshold. It meant reading terrain to identify routes that were invisible from defensive positions, understanding light and shadow to know when and where movement would be visible, and having patience to wait for the precise moments when circumstances allowed undetectable approach. Tso explained his tactical concept to the 3 soldiers he'd selected for the operation, men he'd worked with previously and who'd demonstrated they could follow complex instructions, maintain discipline under stress, and adapt to unusual circumstances. German bunkers are strong against artillery and direct assault, he told them, but they're vulnerable to approaches the Germans don't expect because those approaches violate conventional military logic. We're going to move like Apache warriors, not like Army infantry. That means silence absolute enough that we can approach within meters of bunkers without being detected, patience to wait for hours if necessary for the right moment to act, and trust in methods that aren't in any field manual you've read. The 3 soldiers, Privates James Cordova, Robert Whitman, and Daniel Chen, had all served with Tso for months and had seen him demonstrate tracking and fieldcraft abilities that exceeded anything conventional Army training produced. They trusted his competence, even if they didn't fully understand the cultural knowledge that informed it. Tso's planning was meticulous, but based on principles that didn't appear in conventional military doctrine. He studied aerial reconnaissance photos and patrol reports, not just to identify bunker locations, but to understand the terrain holistically, vegetation patterns, drainage routes, sight lines from defensive positions, areas where natural features would create dead space invisible to German observers. He analyzed this intelligence using Apache environmental reading methods that went beyond tactical map reading to understanding landscape as 3-dimensional dynamic environment. He identified approach routes that conventional doctrine would have dismissed as tactically unsound, paths that seemed too exposed or too difficult to traverse silently. But Tso understood that exposed and difficult were judgments based on conventional movement assumptions. Using Apache methods of terrain exploitation and silent movement, routes that looked impossible became viable because the movement techniques made detection unlikely despite apparent exposure. The timing was critical. Tso selected a night when intelligence indicated cloud cover would eliminate moonlight, but when conditions wouldn't be so severe that German defenders would maintain maximum alert. He wanted darkness deep enough to make visual detection difficult, but not weather so threatening that Germans would be expecting unusual activity. He equipped the team minimally: standard demolitions, satchel charges, and TNT blocks, weapons for emergency defense, but with clear instructions that firing would indicate tactical failure, and materials that wouldn't make noise during movement. He rejected most of the equipment conventional doctrine would have included. No radio, too risky that transmission might be detected. No grenades, too loud for the silent approach he planned. No extra ammunition, weight that would make silent movement more difficult. The final briefing focused on discipline and silence. Once we enter the operational area, we maintain absolute sound discipline. No talking, no equipment noise, no movement that creates detectable sound. We communicate through hand signals you've learned and through proximity, staying close enough to see each other in darkness. If something goes wrong, if we're detected, we withdraw immediately and silently. The mission succeeds through silence, or it doesn't succeed. By the evening of March 22, 1945, the team was ready to prove that Apache tactical knowledge could eliminate German bunkers with an effectiveness that conventional combined arms operations couldn't match, ready to demonstrate that one night of silent warfare could achieve what weeks of artillery and assault would struggle to accomplish. Sergeant Tso and his three-man team departed American lines at 2100 hours on March 22, 1945, moving through a gap in the perimeter that had been arranged to allow their passage without alerting adjacent units to unusual activity. They moved in single file, spacing themselves at intervals that allowed each man to maintain visual contact with the soldier ahead, while remaining separated enough that a single burst of fire couldn't hit multiple targets. The movement through the gap and across no man's land toward the German defensive line used techniques that had nothing to do with conventional patrol doctrine. Conventional doctrine taught fire team movement, coordinated rushes from cover to cover, security halts to observe before advancing, tactical formations that provided mutual support. Tso's team moved differently, using Apache methods that emphasized environmental awareness and invisibility over mutual fire support. They traveled slowly, covering perhaps 100 meters in the first hour, moving only when ambient noise, wind in trees, distant artillery, animal sounds, would mask any unavoidable sounds they made. They paused frequently, not on schedule, but based on environmental cues, freezing when bird calls changed in ways that might indicate the birds had detected their presence, waiting when they heard German voices carrying across night air to determine if the voices suggested alertness or routine guard duty. The German defensive line wasn't a continuous trench, but a series of bunkers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire while being separated enough that single artillery strikes couldn't eliminate multiple positions. Between the bunkers were obstacles, wire, mines in some areas, cleared ground where approaching forces would be exposed to observation and fire from multiple positions. Tso's route avoided the obvious approaches between bunkers. Instead, he used terrain features that conventional tactics would have dismissed as impassable or tactically unsuitable. A drainage ravine that was partially flooded and filled with thorny vegetation, areas where minefields created no-go zones that the Germans apparently assumed prevented all approach, dead ground behind ridge lines where bunker sight lines couldn't reach. Moving through this terrain silently required capabilities that conventional training didn't develop. Tso had learned from his grandfather how to move through difficult terrain without creating the sounds that marked human passage, how to place feet to avoid breaking branches, how to move through vegetation by working with its natural patterns rather than forcing through it, how to maintain balance in unstable footing without the corrective movements that create noise. The 3 soldiers following him had been coached but couldn't fully replicate Apache-level proficiency. What made the operation possible was Tso's ability to choose routes and timing that accommodated their limitations, selecting paths where perfect silence was less critical because ambient noise provided masking, pausing when conditions required absolute quiet that he could maintain, but his team might struggle with. By midnight, they'd penetrated the German defensive line and were positioned in dead ground between bunkers that the Germans apparently assumed was secure because it was within their defensive perimeter and because they couldn't imagine enemy forces infiltrating that deeply without detection. Tso spent 30 minutes observing bunker routines from this interior position, watching sentry patterns, listening to conversations that carried through ventilation openings, understanding the defensive organization in ways that exterior observation couldn't reveal. He'd identified the first target, a bunker that appeared to be a command and observation post based on the radio antenna, and the fact that personnel from other bunkers periodically approached it for what seemed like reporting or coordination. Eliminating this position first would disrupt German defensive coordination and potentially create confusion that would make subsequent bunker eliminations easier. The approach to the first bunker took over an hour to cover perhaps 40 meters. Tso moved when sentries were looking away, when conversation inside the bunker masked potential sounds, when environmental conditions created moments of opportunity. His movement was so patient and so attuned to the defensive awareness patterns that even though he crossed ground that should have been under direct observation, he remained undetected because he was never visible during the brief moments when sentries were actually looking, rather than going through the motions of security duty. By Euro 1:30 hours, he was positioned within 3 meters of the bunker's rear wall, close enough to hear German voices clearly, close enough to observe the structure's ventilation system and identify where demolitions would be most effective, and still completely undetected despite proximity that conventional doctrine would have considered impossible to achieve without alerting defenders. The silent night had begun, and the first bunker was about to be eliminated using Apache tactics that would prove more effective than anything conventional combined arms doctrine could accomplish. First bunker's destruction at 01:45 hours established the pattern that would repeat 14 times over the following hours. Tso positioned satchel charges against the rear wall near the ventilation system, a location that conventional assault teams rarely approached because the rear of bunkers was typically the most heavily defended angle. But Apache tactics emphasized attacking from directions the enemy considered secure, exploiting defensive assumptions rather than confronting defensive strength. The demolition technique was precise rather than overwhelming. Conventional bunker assault used maximum explosive force to guarantee destruction, massive charges that created noise and blast effects visible and audible across entire sectors. Tso used carefully calculated charges, positioned where structural analysis suggested they'd achieve maximum effect with minimum explosive signature, enough to collapse the bunker or make it uninhabitable, but placed and sized to minimize the sound and light that would alert adjacent positions. He set the fuse for 10-minute delay, giving his team time to withdraw to positions where they could observe results and prepare for the next target. The explosion, when it came, was loud enough to alert nearby German positions that something had occurred, but muffled enough by the bunker's structure and careful charge placement that its exact location wasn't immediately obvious. German forces in adjacent bunkers reacted with heightened alert, but without clear understanding of what had happened or where the threat had come from. From his observation position, Tso watched the German response, sentries emerging from bunkers to scan surrounding terrain, shouted conversations between positions trying to determine if they were under artillery fire or if the explosion had been accident or sabotage. The confusion was exactly what Apache tactics sought to create. Defensive awareness heightened but unfocused, attention directed outward toward expected threat directions rather than toward the silent presence that was already moving toward the next target. The second bunker was eliminated at 0230, the third at 0315. Each elimination refined the method. Tso learned German response patterns, understood their communication procedures between bunkers, identified which positions had alert sentries and which had defenders going through security routines mechanically without genuine vigilance. By the fourth bunker, the German defensive organization was beginning to fracture psychologically. The bunker positions were being eliminated systematically, but without defenders understanding how. No artillery bombardment, no assault forces detected, just explosions that appeared to originate from within or immediately adjacent to positions that should have been secure. The cumulative effect was confusion, escalating to fear that they were facing a threat they couldn't identify or counter. Tso exploited this deteriorating defensive psychology. German sentries were now hyper-alert, but their attention was diffused, watching in all directions, firing at shadows, calling out challenges to movements that were imagination or animals rather than actual threats. This degraded attention to real threats made Tso's approaches easier rather than harder. Defenders were reacting to false positives while missing the actual infiltration that was occurring with patient precision. The pattern continued through the night. Bunkers 5 and 6 were eliminated in quick succession, taking advantage of a period when German forces were focused on what they thought was movement to their south. Actually sounds created by local animals, but interpreted as threats because of the psychological stress accumulating from unexplained bunker losses. By 0500 hours, 11 bunkers had been destroyed, and the German defensive line was effectively collapsing. Remaining bunkers were abandoning positions without orders. Defenders unwilling to remain in structures that seemed to be targeted by forces they couldn't detect or fight. Some bunkers were being eliminated without even requiring demolitions. Tso's team would approach abandoned positions and destroy them methodically without resistance. The 13th and 14th bunkers were eliminated by 0630 as dawn was beginning to provide enough light that continued operations would have risked visual detection. Tso ordered withdrawal, and the team extracted using the same silent movement methods that had brought them into the German defensive zone, moving through terrain that German forces were still nervously monitoring, but using routes and timing that kept them invisible, even in increasing daylight. They reached American lines at 0745 hours, having been in the operational area for over 9 hours. Having destroyed 14 bunkers that intelligence had assessed would require days or weeks of conventional operations to eliminate, and having accomplished this with 0 American casualties while creating German defensive collapse through psychological effects as much as through physical destruction. Lieutenant Morrison was waiting at the designated return point, having spent the night tracking explosion reports and monitoring whether conventional assault forces would be needed. When Tso reported the results, 14 bunkers eliminated, team intact, German defensive line collapsed. Morrison's first response was to verify whether the count was accurate or if Tso had misunderstood the reporting requirement. The verification came rapidly through multiple sources, confirming that the German positions were indeed destroyed or abandoned. What should have been impossible, according to conventional military doctrine, had been achieved through Apache tactical methods that existed completely outside Western military thinking, proving that cultural knowledge about silent warfare and patience could be more effective than firepower and mass, and that one sergeant, using traditional indigenous tactics, could accomplish in a single night what a reinforced company might struggle to achieve in weeks. The Division Intelligence Section's analysis of the operation revealed both the extraordinary nature of what had been achieved and the institutional difficulty in understanding how it had been accomplished. The analysis attempted to explain Tso's success using conventional military frameworks, but the explanations were inadequate because the tactics existed outside those frameworks. The initial intelligence assessment attributed the results to exceptional individual initiative and demolitions expertise, combined with favorable tactical conditions. The language was bureaucratically safe, but fundamentally misleading. It suggested Tso's success was the result of conventional skills applied exceptionally well, rather than the application of knowledge systems that conventional training didn't encompass. When the division commander requested detailed tactical breakdown of how one NCO and 3 enlisted men had eliminated 14 bunkers, the response revealed how little conventional military analysis could capture what had actually occurred. The intelligence officer documented approach routes, demolition placement, and timing, but couldn't adequately explain how Tso had achieved the silence that made undetected approach possible, how he'd read German defensive psychology to exploit moments of vulnerability, or how he'd synthesized environmental awareness and patience into capabilities that seemed impossible from conventional perspective. An attempt to replicate Tso's methods using conventionally trained demolitions teams failed instructively. A 4-man team briefed on Tso's reported approach routes and methods attempted a similar operation against a different bunker sector. They were detected within 30 minutes of crossing into German-held territory, took casualties from defensive fires, and had to be extracted without eliminating any targets. The failure demonstrated that the tactics couldn't be easily transferred. They required capabilities that came from cultural knowledge and lifetime development rather than briefing and instruction. Colonel Morrison, who'd initially been skeptical of Tso's proposal, wrote in his after-action analysis, "Sergeant Tso achieved results that seem impossible when analyzed through conventional tactical frameworks. His success wasn't attributable to superior equipment, numerical advantage, or favorable conditions. The operation succeeded because he possessed knowledge about silent movement, environmental reading, and patience that our standard training doesn't develop and that I don't fully understand even after witnessing the results." Morrison recommended that Tso be assigned to train other personnel in his methods, but the recommendation revealed institutional incomprehension about the nature of what made Tso effective. The assumption was that the tactics could be taught through conventional military instruction, classes, demonstrations, practice exercises, but Tso's capabilities came from cultural inheritance and lifetime practice that couldn't be compressed into training modules. When division staff approached Tso about developing training protocols, he explained the limitation directly. What I did comes from knowledge my grandfather taught me, knowledge that Apache people developed over generations for survival and warfare in terrain where silence and patience determined whether you lived or died. I can teach some of the techniques, specific movement methods, ways to read terrain, but the fullness of it requires cultural knowledge and practice that can't happen in military training timelines. You're asking me to teach in weeks what took me a lifetime to learn. The response revealed the institutional bind. The military wanted to replicate Tso's capabilities, but couldn't acknowledge that those capabilities came from indigenous knowledge systems that existed outside military institutional structures. Acknowledging that fully would mean admitting that conventional training was inadequate for certain tactical contexts, that cultural knowledge could be superior to formal military instruction, and that some capabilities simply couldn't be developed through standardized training regardless of resources invested. The solution was to honor Tso's achievement, while avoiding deep examination of its implications. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism, his demolitions expertise was praised, and his tactical initiative was commended. But the specifically Apache nature of his knowledge, the cultural inheritance that had made the operation possible, and the implications about whose knowledge should inform military practice were minimized in official recognition. Tso was offered promotion and assignment to training roles, but he declined both, choosing to remain with his infantry unit where he could continue using his knowledge operationally rather than attempting to teach it in institutional contexts that couldn't adequately support its transmission. The decision was professionally costly, but culturally coherent. He understood that his effectiveness came from being Apache first and soldier second, and that institutional recognition that inverted that priority would ultimately diminish rather than honor what he'd achieved. The end of combat operations in Europe in May 1945 brought recognition for Sergeant Tso that was ceremonial but carefully bounded. He received his Distinguished Service Cross in a division ceremony that acknowledged his extraordinary heroism in single-handedly eliminating enemy fortifications through exceptional demolitions, expertise, and tactical initiative. The citation was accurate in its particulars, but incomplete in its substance. It honored what he'd done without explaining what had made it possible. The ceremony occurred in front of the assembled division, with the commanding general reading the citation and praising Tso's courage and skill. But the speech made no mention of Apache knowledge, traditional tactics, or the cultural inheritance that had enabled the impossible operation. Tso was honored as an individual soldier whose personal exceptional qualities had produced extraordinary results, not as an Apache warrior whose traditional knowledge had proven militarily superior to conventional doctrine. Several soldiers who'd served with Tso understood the incompleteness of this recognition. Private Cordova, who'd been part of the four-man team, later wrote, "They gave him a medal for being brave and skilled, which he was, but they didn't acknowledge that what made him capable of doing what he did was being Apache, knowing things about silence and terrain and patience that came from his grandfather and his culture. They wanted to honor the individual without acknowledging the knowledge system that made him exceptional." The division history published after the war documented the bunker elimination operation as example of individual initiative and exceptional small unit tactics. The account described Tso's actions accurately in terms of what he'd accomplished, but provided no insight into how he'd achieved it beyond generic references to skilled infiltration and expert demolitions placement. The specifically Apache nature of his tactics was absent from the narrative. making his achievement seem like the result of individual exceptional talent rather than cultural knowledge applied to military contexts. This selective commemoration served institutional purposes. It allowed the division to celebrate an extraordinary achievement and honor a soldier who'd contributed materially to reducing casualties and accelerating the advance. But it avoided examining implications that would challenge institutional assumptions, that indigenous knowledge could be tactically superior to conventional military training, that formal instruction had limitations that cultural inheritance could overcome, and that some of the most effective military capabilities came from outside institutional structures. Tso himself was ambivalent about the recognition. He appreciated the acknowledgement of his service and the honor the medal represented, but he understood that the recognition was incomplete. His being Apache wasn't incidental to what he'd accomplished, but central to it, and the institutional reluctance to acknowledge that centrality revealed continuing discomfort with validating indigenous knowledge as militarily significant. When reporters asked him about his tactics during post-war interviews, he described them in general terms that emphasized patience, environmental awareness, and understanding defensive psychology, accurate explanations, but necessarily incomplete, because the cultural knowledge that informed those capabilities couldn't be easily articulated to audiences without framework for understanding Apache tactical traditions. One exchange captured the communication challenge. A reporter asked, "How did you manage to approach 14 bunkers without being detected? What's the secret to that kind of stealth?" Tso's response, "There's no secret. It's knowledge about how to move silently and read terrain that Apache people have developed over generations. My grandfather taught me, his grandfather taught him, and so on, back through time. It's not a trick or a technique. It's a way of understanding landscape and movement that comes from culture." The reporter's article simplified this to, "Sergeant Tso credited his success to patience and careful observation." Accurate, but stripped of the cultural context that Tso had tried to convey, reducing cultural knowledge to individual personality traits. By the time Tso was discharged in late 1945, his extraordinary achievement was part of division lore, but increasingly disconnected from the Apache knowledge that had made it possible. He'd become a symbol of individual heroism and tactical excellence, while the cultural inheritance that had enabled his effectiveness was fading from the narrative, leaving a story about an exceptional soldier that was true but incomplete, honoring the man while obscuring the knowledge system that had made him capable of achieving the impossible. Thomas Tso returned to the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona in October 1945 with a Distinguished Service Cross, an honorable discharge, and a burden that he struggled to articulate even to people who wanted to understand what he'd experienced. He'd proven that Apache tactical knowledge remained effective against modern enemies, that traditional methods his grandfather had taught him could achieve what conventional military training couldn't, and that indigenous warfare expertise was sophisticated rather than primitive. But the recognition he'd received made no mention of the Apache knowledge that had made his achievement possible. His medal citation praised his individual courage and skill. The military records documented his service as a demolition specialist. Nothing official acknowledged that what had made him capable of eliminating 14 bunkers in a single night was specifically his cultural inheritance, knowledge about silence, terrain reading, and patience that came from being Apache and being taught by elders who maintained warrior traditions despite generations of suppression. The disconnect between what he'd done and how it was recognized created isolation that was difficult to bridge. When younger Apache men asked about his service, wanting to understand what he'd accomplished and how it related to their cultural heritage, he could describe the operation, but struggled to convey the spiritual and cultural dimensions that had made it possible. The military had honored his actions while stripping them of cultural context, leaving him with a story about individual exceptional performance that was true but incomplete. His grandfather, who taught him the traditional knowledge he'd used in combat, understood the burden differently. "You proved the old ways still have power," the old man told him. "You used knowledge they tried to destroy, and it worked better than everything they tried to teach you in their army. But they won't acknowledge that, because it would mean admitting we were right to preserve what they tried to take away." Tso attempted to teach traditional movement and tracking skills to younger community members, hoping to preserve knowledge that had proven its contemporary relevance. But he found that federal policies and economic pressures were making traditional practices economically marginal, that education systems emphasized assimilation over cultural preservation, and that the knowledge that had enabled him to save American lives during war was being systematically discouraged during peace. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same government that had awarded him a medal for using Apache knowledge was implementing policies that made preserving that knowledge difficult. The military had exploited his cultural inheritance when it was tactically useful, but showed no interest in supporting its preservation now that immediate military necessity had passed. In the 1950s, when the Korean War created new demand for soldiers with specialized skills, military recruiters visited the reservation looking for men who might possess tracking and fieldcraft abilities. Tso was approached about serving as trainer or advisor, teaching Apache methods to conventional soldiers. He declined, explaining to the recruiters, "What I know can't be taught the way the Army teaches things. It comes from growing up Apache, from learning knowledge that's passed down through families, from understanding the land and movement in ways that require cultural context and years of practice. You can't put that in a training manual or teach it in a few weeks." The recruiters didn't understand, pressing him with offers of rank and pay. What they couldn't grasp was that Tso's effectiveness hadn't come from individual talent that could be extracted and transferred through instruction. It had come from cultural knowledge that existed only within the context of Apache life and tradition, and attempting to separate it from that context would destroy what made it valuable. By the 1960s, as Tso aged and the traditional knowledge he possessed became rarer in Apache communities, he recognized that what he'd proven during the war, that indigenous knowledge could be militarily superior to conventional training, would likely be forgotten along with the knowledge itself. The military had used Apache expertise when desperate necessity forced them to acknowledge its value, but they'd made no institutional commitment to preserving or even acknowledging that expertise once the crisis passed. He carried this recognition silently, understanding that his achievement would be remembered as individual heroism, while the cultural knowledge that had enabled it would continue to fade, and that the lesson his success should have taught about whose knowledge has value would remain unlearned because institutional assumptions about cultural hierarchies were more durable than battlefield evidence of indigenous superiority. Thomas Tso's story remained relatively obscure until 2008, when a military historian researching distinguished service Cross recipients from World War II encountered the citation for the bunker elimination operation and recognized that the described achievement seemed tactically implausible unless the recipient had possessed extraordinary capabilities that conventional training didn't explain. Dr. Helen Key, a specialist in Native American military history, spent 3 years attempting to understand how Tso had achieved what he'd accomplished. She reviewed division records, interviewed soldiers who'd served with him, and eventually located Tso's family members who shared stories about his traditional Apache training and the cultural knowledge he'd used during the war. What Dr. Key discovered was that the operation had been even more remarkable than the official citation suggested, not just tactically successful, but representative of indigenous knowledge systems producing military capabilities that Western training couldn't replicate. She documented that Tso's success had come specifically from Apache cultural inheritance, that his tactics had been traditional methods adapted to modern warfare contexts, and that the institutional recognition he'd received had systematically minimized the cultural sources of his exceptional performance. She compiled her research into a book published in 2012 that examined Tso's achievement as case study in how indigenous knowledge could produce military effectiveness that exceeded conventional capabilities, and how institutional discomfort with acknowledging that reality had led to selective recognition that honored individuals while obscuring cultural knowledge systems. The book prompted renewed attention to Tso's service and advocacy for fuller recognition. In 2015, the Department of Defense issued a statement acknowledging that Staff Sergeant Thomas Tso's extraordinary achievement reflected not only individual courage, but also traditional Apache knowledge that enabled tactical capabilities exceptional by any standard. The statement was more explicit about cultural knowledge than previous recognition had been, though it stopped short of examining why that knowledge had been systematically excluded from institutional practice, despite proven effectiveness. Some Apache community leaders and military historians argued that appropriate recognition would require more than retrospective acknowledgement. It would require institutional examination of why indigenous knowledge had been exploited during wartime, but not supported for preservation or incorporated into military training during peacetime. But that deeper reckoning remained incomplete, with recognition focused on honoring Tso's individual service rather than confronting systemic issues about whose knowledge gets valued and supported. By 2024, Tso's story had achieved limited visibility. It was known among specialists in military history and in Apache communities, where it was taught as example of traditional knowledge maintaining contemporary relevance. But it remained largely absent from mainstream military histories, where discussions of small unit tactics and demolitions operations made no substantive mention of the role indigenous cultural knowledge had played in one of the most extraordinary tactical achievements of the European theater. The tactical lessons Tso's operation taught remained similarly unintegrated. Modern military doctrine acknowledged the value of silence, patience, and environmental awareness in special operations contexts, but the specifically cultural dimensions of how those capabilities were developed, the role of traditional knowledge transmission, the importance of cultural context for certain tactical proficiencies, remained unexamined in institutional training frameworks that continued to emphasize standardized instruction over cultural inheritance. Thomas Tso died in 1994 at age 73, having received belated but still incomplete recognition for achievement that had proven traditional Apache knowledge was tactically sophisticated and militarily effective. The knowledge he'd used to eliminate 14 bunkers in a single night was increasingly rare in Apache communities, fading under the same pressures that had made its preservation difficult throughout his lifetime. His legacy poses questions that remain incompletely answered. How much military capability is being lost because institutional training frameworks can't accommodate knowledge that comes from cultural inheritance rather than formal instruction? How many other tactical achievements comparable to Tso's might be possible if indigenous knowledge systems were supported and integrated rather than exploited during crises and forgotten afterward? And what would military effectiveness look like if institutions learned to value expertise wherever it exists rather than only where it conforms to Western training models? The silent tactics that destroyed 14 bunkers in a single night proved that some of the most effective military capabilities come from outside institutional structures, from cultural knowledge that formal training can't replicate. But the lesson that proof should have taught, that indigenous knowledge deserves institutional support and recognition not just when desperately needed, but as ongoing valuable resource, remains incompletely learned, suggesting that institutional assumptions about whose expertise matters are more resistant to change than the tactical effectiveness that should have challenged them. Sergeant Tso's achievement was extraordinary. What remains tragic is how thoroughly the knowledge that made it possible has been honored in rhetoric while being allowed to fade in practice, and how the institutions that benefited from indigenous expertise during war have shown so little commitment to preserving or supporting that expertise during peace.